Everyone's heard of Hadrian's famous wall that runs from coast to coast across the north of Britain, marking the furthest limit of the Roman Empire. That wall was built in the 130s. Not many people know that in the 140s a further wall was built some miles to the north, running across the south of Scotland from the Firth of Forth to the Clyde. It was built on the orders of Antoninus Pius, and so, not unnaturally, it is known as the Antonine Wall. Unlike Hadrian's Wall, which ended up being built of stone, this wall was a much less grand affair. It consisted mainly of a ditch and a bank. Behind me, you can see what is perhaps the best preserved portion of the Antonine Wall. This is on the outskirts of Falkirk, at a place known as Watling Lodge, not far from the famous Falkirk Wheel. And here you can see the wall and the bank and the ditch preserved almost to their full height and depths. In other places, the wall has been ploughed under, the ditch has been filled in, but here it remains more or less as the Roman soldiers would have seen it. In many ways, building the wall here made a lot of sense. It was a much shorter distance from the Clyde to the Firth of Forth. It was only about 40 miles, whereas Hadrian's Wall extends for nearly 60 miles. As well as the decreased cost of building the wall and repairing it and maintaining it, there was also the considerably decreased cost of manning the wall, because this wall, like Hadrian's Wall, also had mile castles and forts every so often, regular patrols along the length of the wall, so you needed far fewer soldiers for 40 miles as opposed to 60. The downside, of course, was that because you were that much further north, you controlled a much larger area, and the wild Picts, the original inhabitants of this part of Scotland, did not take kindly to the Roman presence. Just a few miles west of Falkirk, you have the area known as Rough Castle. Perhaps the name stems from the Roman fortlet that was built here. But here also you have a magnificent stretch of the Antonine Wall, and you can see how it was constructed, with the natural bank on that side, the deep ditch dug, and the earth from the ditch thrown up on either side of the ditch to form a bank on that side, which was to make it more difficult for soldiers to run down into the ditch and up the other side, and of course the bank on that side, behind which the Romans sheltered. Probably there was a wooden palisade on the top, and that provided additional protection for the Romans. Up there in the fort, the Romans ostensibly were facing that way, north, to keep the barbarians out, the Picts out. But it seems that they were equally worried about what might be going on down there in ostensibly Roman Britain. Because whereas outside the fort they had the main Antonine Wall with its deep ditch and its bank and the lilia, the holes dug in the ground outside it, here, on the supposedly friendly side, they had 1, 2, 3 banks and 2 ditches. Clearly, they were not at all sure of what might be sneaking around behind, or what the Picts that they had conquered and incorporated into the Roman Empire between the Antonine Wall and the Hadrian Walls might be up to. And they wanted to be sure that they would be safe. Running the whole length of the Antonine Wall on the Roman side was this road, the military road. And the purpose of the military road was to connect the forts, to enable reinforcements to be rushed from one to the other, and to enable supplies to be carried from base camps out to the little fortlets. The road was very carefully constructed in the usual Roman way, with a stone paved surface on top, and as you can see, with ditches on either side to carry off any rainwater that might fall. And so the road was an all-weather road, one of those miracles of Roman engineering. Whether it led to Rome, I'm not sure, but it certainly supported the might of Rome. Some people have questioned the purpose of the Antonine Wall. Was it defensive? Well, certainly it had defensive features, as the pits which lined the outer bank show, and they can be found at different points all along the wall. But it may primarily have served as a means of control, to make sure that you were able to keep out those you wanted to keep out and only allow in those you were happy to allow in. Here, running across the ditch, you have a causeway, and this was the main Roman road to the north, and it ran right through the heart of the rough castle fort, meaning that anyone wanting to cross into Britain, Roman Britain, had to come along here, pass the defences, pass customs and passport control in the fort, and only then could they go further south. And equally, anyone wanting to go north, perhaps to escape the Romans, perhaps to stir up trouble, whatever, would have to pass through the same process of investigation before he could carry on his way. Just up the hill in front of me is Rough Castle. But in excavations conducted here a few years ago, the archaeologists made a fascinating discovery. In front of the fort was this extensive area of pits. Oval pits, about 4 to 5 feet long, originally 3 feet deep. 20 lines of them, staggered. And the question is, what were they for? The archaeologists suggest that they were lilia. That's a Roman word meaning lily, and it was because these holes, like so, and with a sharpened stake poking up in the middle, were supposed to look a bit like a lily. And so they suggest that these holes had sharpened stakes sticking up in them, and the Romans allowed them to be overgrown so that they were invisible to anyone just looking at the area. But anyone who tried running would either fall into a hole and break his leg, or fall into a hole and be impaled by one of these sharpened stakes. However, there is a problem with that idea, because lilia was circular. Why would you need to dig a 4 feet wide trench in order to put a sharpened stake, or even 2 or 3 sharpened stakes? And the larger the hole, the more difficult it is to be hidden by overgrowing it with weeds, brambles, grass, whatever. I think that these holes had a different purpose. And that is that if you try going straight, you have to jump over a hole, and that risks falling into the hole and impaling yourself perhaps. But if you went diagonally, then you had a clear pathway that you could follow. And by following this pathway, not only would it take you longer to get to the wall where the Romans were waiting for you, but your shield would be in this hand, your sword would be in this hand, and your side would be completely exposed. And the Roman archers up on the wall would be able to pick you off more or less at their leisure, because your whole side would be unprotected. After a mere 20 years, a later emperor decided that this wall was a wall too far, and withdrew the troops back to Hadrian's wall. And no doubt the Picts rejoiced that the Romans had gone, that they had their independence back. But in fact it was a very bad thing, because it meant that Scotland remained a land of barbarian clans and tribes right down to the 1700s. The same could be said of Germany, where the Roman limes, the border, marked the difference between the settled, cultured, civilized southern parts and the wild tribes of Germany, whose divisions remained right down until the 1800s with the unification of Germany under Bismarck. It reminds me of the saying in Scripture, "There is a way that seemeth right to a man, but the ends thereof are the ways of death." Sometimes what we think is best is not for the best. It's always wisest to let God have control, even if that means being occupied by the Romans.